Unit 1, Presentation 1. What is parole? Parole is the early but conditional release of a person from prison. It's early because there is no legal requirement to release the person at that point in time. A release on parole is a discretionary release, not a required release. It is conditional in that there are certain conditions of parole. Some of them are general ones that apply to everyone, and some of them can be specific ones that are tailored to the individual. But if any of those conditions are breached, the person can be returned to prison to finish out their sentence. Let's consider parole in the context of a whole sentence. This graphic here is not to scale, but it represents a full sentence. There are, broadly speaking, 3 phases to it. You have a fixed point in time at the start of the sentence and a fixed point in time at the end of the sentence, the maximum expiration date. You then have this phase here, which is marked by the mandatory supervised release date. That date, known as the MSR, is the total length of the sentence minus any good time, or we can refer to them as diminution credits, which a person earns. The MSR is a moving date though, because the good time comes off not all in one go, but on a monthly basis. So at the start of a sentence, the MSR will be the same as the maximum expiration date, and it will slowly move to the left as the time goes by. If you hear the MSR mentioned when helping or going up for a parole hearing, that's likely to be the MSR at that point in time. It won't be the MSR that it would finally be if the person were not to be granted parole at any point. Even in jurisdictions which don't have a parole system, there tends to be this phase of the sentence, this good time phase, because it represents a mechanism for keeping total prison population down, and it also is a mechanism for encouraging good behaviour. The next date to consider is parole eligibility. That is the earliest point in time at which a person could be released on parole. This is going to differ in different jurisdictions, but the general rule in Maryland is that eligibility is reached halfway through a sentence for a violent crime and a quarter way through a sentence for a non-violent crime. The first parole hearing a person gets is usually scheduled 6 months before parole eligibility is reached. That's because even if parole is granted at a parole hearing, the person doesn't get out that very day, because there's a certain amount of out processing that has to take place, such as the home plan being confirmed. So that's why the first hearing takes place towards the end of this phase, so that if the parole commission were minded for the person to be released on the day they reach eligibility, the hearing has to take place beforehand in order for the administrative things to happen in the meantime. One possibility that could happen is you have this first parole hearing and parole isn't granted, but a rehearing is scheduled for a set number of years' time. That will often be 2 years or 3 years, but it can vary depending on the length of the person's sentence. And it's known as, or it's colloquially referred to as getting a hit, so a 2-year hit or a 3-year hit. Another possibility is that parole will be granted, but instead of release happening as soon as the administrative out-processing has taken place, a date of delayed release will be set, and that admin will happen so that release happens on a specified date. That date could be set really even up to this sort of point in time that has happened, that it's almost up to the mandatory supervised release date. And when that happens, although the person has been granted parole, they often can feel disappointed that they hardly got parole at all. Another possibility at a hearing, and this would usually happen on the first hearing rather than at subsequent hearings, is a person could simply be refused parole. and that would mean they won't get any more hearings. Instead, they will serve their sentence until their mandatory supervised release date. If a person is released on parole, or if they're released at their MSR, they remain under the supervision of the Department of Parole and Probation until the date of maximum expiration. And so during that time frame, they run the risk of being returned to prison if they breach any of the conditions of their release. One of the reasons why Prepare exists is we have this hypothesis that helping people prepare for parole, doing that at scale, is going to move the average point in time that someone is released, move it slightly to the left here. And if you can do that with the average point in time, you're going to affect the total prison population. So in that sense, it's a way of trying to address mass incarceration by sort of chipping at it from the back end. It's also a possibility that parole could be used more if the legislature were so minded. That has happened in other states. And how that would work is that the criteria for release would be made more generous, so that the effect then would also be that the average point of release would move to the left on the timeline. And so in that sense, parole can function as a sort of faucet. It can be loosened or tightened in order to let more people or less people out of prison.